All right, we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm Yuval Levin of the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you for being here with us. This is really Curtis's show. Literally, we're taping an episode of Curtis's podcast, and so he's going to take over and introduce. But I just wanted to say a word about him to start, for those of you who might need a sense of who he is. You really should know Curtis Chang. He is an unusual figure in our public life because he's a kind of bridge between two worlds that don't often get bridged. He's, on the one hand, engaged and involved in the world that we might call management consultant. Is that an insult?
No, that's no insult.
Leadership consultant.
I think on my business card, so.
He started and runs a successful firm in that world, and he teaches strategic management at American University. And is a real figure in that world. And he is also, at the same time, an important figure in what I would say is the world of evangelical theological thought. He is a theologian, and he is a person who thinks deeply about the questions that are particularly important to American Christianity in this moment. He teaches at the Duke Divinity School. He's a fellow at the Fuller Theological Seminary. He has a kind of maybe a ministry.
Sure, let's call it that.
Called Redeeming Babel, and this podcast and other work on that front are all a part of that. And part of what being that bridge has allowed him to do is develop a series of categories and lenses for thinking about the challenges that our society faces that are really distinct. One of those has to do in particular with the concept of anxiety, as he defines it in an unusual way. And we're going to talk especially about that today, I think. It's a very, very helpful lens for thinking about some contemporary challenges in what surely feels like an anxious moment, and anxious in a particular way that Curtis has certainly helped me to understand, and I think is helping a lot of people to understand. So with that, by way of introduction, I really am going to just turn it over to you, Curtis, and this is your show.
Well, thank you. Welcome to a recording of the Good Faith Podcast, which is a production of Redeeming Babel. And we're going to do a dueling introductions because I'm going to respond to that introduction and one-up you with an introduction of yourself. So a lot of you know Yuval Levin, but if you don't, you should know Yuval Levin. He is, I would say, one of the preeminent scholars about American institutional life. And he directs, for those of you who are new to AEI, he directs the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies program at AEI. We were just talking about this, and here's how I would describe his work and the work of his center. So I think all of us feel like we are in something of the dark ages of American politics and culture right now, like, don't we? Like that's a fair assessment. Well, if you know the history of the dark ages, if you read a book called How the Irish Saved Civilization, you know that the monasteries in Ireland played a pivotal role because they preserved the best of Western civilization when everything else was crumbling and falling apart. They both preserved it and extended the Western tradition in a very important way when nobody was really paying attention to them. But they preserved it such that when Western Europe was ready to finally rebuild, they could draw on the deep riches and traditions that not only had been preserved, but actually been even extended, kind of in a secret, relatively secret, I mean, it wasn't secret, nobody was trying to keep it secret, but just nobody was paying attention to it. Yuval's work at AEI is, I think, one of the critical monasteries, in quote-unquote monasteries of our day. He is assembling, I think, a world-class collection of scholars that are trying to preserve the best of the American best classical tradition, classic conservative tradition, so that when the political system, when our political culture is ready to rebuild, it doesn't have to start from scratch. It doesn't have to start from the rubbles. But actually, there are people who are thinking about how to translate the best of the tradition into actual policy proposals so that, again, when we are ready to rebuild, we have the tools at our disposal. So I am super excited that his work gives me hope for the future. And so it's an honor and a privilege to have him as a guest on the Good Faith Podcast. And he's the guy on institutions. So if you want to think about institutions, read his book, Time to Build. Anytime you talk about institutions and people say, you know, institutions, they've become platforms, not molds of character. That's Yuval's line. That construct has entered our political discourse because of Yuval. I've just written recently a book on anxiety. And so we thought it'd be fun to mash these two topics together and talk about institutions and anxiety. And we're going to go, just to give you a map of how we're going to go do this, we're going to talk first about are institutions actually causing our anxiety? Are they actually causing our high levels of anxiety? Then we're going to talk about, are institutions themselves anxious? Is there such a thing as an anxious institution or institutional anxiety, if you will? And then third, we'll talk about what does this mean for all of us who have institutional lives, right? And maybe ourselves anxious, maybe having anxiety caused by our institutions, but also realize we're part of perhaps anxious institutions. So we're going to do that. We're going to talk back and forth for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to try to save 15 minutes to take questions from you all. So if you have questions, I see some people already taking notes, look like studious. Go ahead, write those down, because we're going to have some time for questions like that. So Yuval, let's get started. Anxiety and institutions. When I was writing my book on anxiety, what struck me was how much analysis of anxiety tended to be either at the individual level, right? So what are individual causes, family of origin causes, personality factors at the individual level, or at the broad macro social level. It's smartphones, it's technology, it's COVID, it's economic uncertainty. But between these two levels, individual and macro societal, there's a lot of space where most human beings live. And that space, this intermediary stage, is really influenced and structured by institutions, by organizations. So to what extent, when we think about these high levels of anxiety that we all know about, we all feel, how much do we have to pay attention to this medium level of organizations and institutional life?
Well, thank you, Curtis. First of all, I really appreciate the introduction. I think it's the first time I've ever been compared to a monk, and I like it. I think you asked the question just the right way, because oftentimes, in general, when we think about our social challenges, our country's problems, we tend to think in one of these two levels. We either think about the kinds of challenges that people confront in their personal lives. We talk about loneliness and isolation, alienation, or we think about the sorts of challenges that we confront as a society as a whole. So we talk about economic trends, we talk about the breakdown of this or that. When we do think about how we relate to each other, which after all is where most anxiety has to happen, where most social breakdown has to happen, at the junctures, at the interstices of life, when we think about those, we also think in individual terms. That is, we think about our society as this big open space full of individuals, and the problem is they're having trouble connecting. And so we talk about building bridges or tearing down walls. These are important things. They're not wrong, but they ignore the ways in which we actually interact with each other in life, which almost always happen through structures of social life, through the various ways in which we organize our interactions, right? So if you think about the 10 people that you know best, how do you actually know these people? I think the answer you would give would be a list of institutions: family, school, work, church. That's how you know these people. But we don't often think about those institutions. We just think about the people we know. When you think about the life of our society, again, you tend to think in big, broad terms rather than thinking about the medium through which you actually live your own life. If our society is a big open space, it's not a space filled with individuals. It's a space filled with these structures of social life, these clumps of people, each of which is organized around a shared purpose. And those are institutions. Some institutions are formal, maybe corporate, a company, a school, a church. They have a real formal structure. Some institutions are a little bit less formal than that. You might think of the institution of the family, which is the foremost institution of any society. You might think about marriage or a profession. The rule of law as an institution. What holds them together is that they are all durable forms of common action. They let us act together by giving each of us a role in relation to other people and in relation to a common purpose. So if you think about a school, someone is a student, someone is a teacher, someone is a principal, someone is a parent. Those people are defined by a role that is ultimately a function of what they're doing together. And that role helps them know who they are, what to do, how to judge particular situations. I'm the principal of this school, so in this situation, what's required of me is to take these things into account. That's enormously important for allowing us to plan for the future, for allowing us to act together, for allowing us to pursue the things that matter to us in life. And when institutions break down, we lose the ability to understand our roles in those ways in relation to each other. We lose that source of trust, that object of devotion and loyalty, and that makes it very, very difficult for us to know what our role is. How do I think about the future? Who am I here in relation to these people and those people? And the loss of that role is, I think, a tremendous source of anxiety for people. Because part of what anxiety really is, and this I learned from you, Curtis, anxiety is a way of approaching the future with fear. It's all about the future. It's about things that haven't happened yet and that fill you with dread about whether you'll be able to handle them. And that means that the loss of the structure and role that's given to you by an institution is a tremendous source of anxiety. If you approach the future not knowing quite where you fit and where other people fit, and who do I look to when something happens, and who do I trust when I need to know something, the loss of the ability to do that is a tremendous source of anxiety. And so I think institutions cause anxiety when they fail to provide us with a role, when they fail to provide us with an object of devotion, with an object of authority or commitment. And that's what we're seeing happening in American society now. On a large scale, we are losing the ability to have that trust in the institutions around us, and therefore losing the ability to organize how we think about our place in the future. And I think that's exactly what anxiety is.
Okay, I want to pin on this whole fear of the future thing, but talk for a minute about this roles thing that you're talking about, how institutions organize our lives, tell us who we are, how we're supposed to relate to one another. I think we can all imagine if suddenly all your reference points for who you are, who's going to provide for you, who your closest trust relationships are going to be, if all that evaporated overnight, that would throw most of us into deep anxiety, into a sense of disorientation. So conceptually, I think we see the linkage between if an institution is failing to tell you who you are and what you're supposed to do in this world, then that is going to lead to great anxiety. But take it to one level of specificity. Like, think about the people in this room and the institutions that they're a part of. In what ways are they experiencing institutional fragility or breakdown, and how might that translate then into anxiety for them?
Yeah, I mean, let's think about a role. A role is a very important part of how we make ethical judgments. The way that I think about ethics, it's not about deciding what should I do in this situation, but about beginning from a sense of what kind of person do I want to be? And then asking yourself, what would that kind of person do in this situation? And the way to think about what kind of person do I want to be is very much shaped by the institutions in your life. So that when those weaken, when it becomes much harder for you to understand yourself as a parent, as a teacher, as a member of a community, as a leader or a follower in a particular part of your life, it becomes much harder for you to know what kind of person you're trying to be, and therefore how to make this decision that's in front of me. So that there are ways that our roles sort of force us to conform into a particular way of being. If I'm on the highway and somebody cuts me off and I want to just yell at them what I think of them, but I've got two kids in the back, I'm going to behave in a different way than I would have if there wasn't somebody there to remind me that in relation to them, I'm the parent here, right? And that happens constantly in our lives when we find ourselves in a situation where if it were just me, I'd be doing one thing, but it's not just me. I work here. I live here. I am the pastor. I am, I'm the teacher. And that means that I have to do something other than I would do if it were just me out in the world. Having that role is tremendously important for finding our way in the world and deciding what it means to be a good person, what it means in particular, in this situation, what kind of decision I ought to be making. And I think that kind of virtue ethics, that kind of way of thinking about what does it take to be a good person of the sort I'm working to be in the situation I'm in, is what becomes very, very difficult when we can't trust the institutions anymore, when we don't have a sense that the people leading the institution we're part of are trustworthy or are doing their job, when the people who are running our political system are behaving in the way they ought to, and therefore I should behave in the way I ought to. And there's a thing about norms, right? A lot of these things are not laws, they're not requirements, they're not binding. We do them because we choose to do them, and a lot of why we choose to do them is because other people are clearly choosing to. And when that begins to fall away, when there's a cascade of irresponsibility, of dereliction, of other people in positions of authority not behaving as though they are in positions of authority, then we all lose the sense of what our responsibility is. I think a lot of what we're living through in American life now could be described as a kind of collapse of responsibility. And it's not one person's fault. It's a sense that if they're not doing their job, why should I do my job? I'm not a sucker. I'm not going to just be the only person here who's following the rules. And at some point, that leaves no one offering any kind of example of what it would mean to be the kind of person who follows the rules. And so a recovery of that requires, in a sense, everybody to decide that responsibility matters, and that's no easy thing.
You know, this notion that institutions anchor us by telling us our roles and our virtues that we ought to adopt makes me think about a statistic and a story. So the statistic is this, is that studies on a lifespan of a person, there are two moments when your anxiety tends to spike. One is your adolescent, when you're an adolescent, and then the other is when you retire. And it strikes me that institutions actually is a lens of an answer to that, because on the adolescent stage, you're leaving kind of the cocoon of the institution of your family, and you're being thrust into the world. So you're at this liminal stage where you're sort of without an institutional anchors. You're still trying to find them. And that perhaps may be an explanation why that, along with probably a lot of other biological factors, are why adolescents are so vulnerable to anxiety. And then retirement, because you're then exiting a life of established institutional identity, and now suddenly you're like an adult. It's your second phase of adolescence. You're like, I need to find out who I am. And it's interesting that I hadn't made that connection until you described this formational dimension of institutions.
Yeah, you know, it's very interesting, and I do think that, in a sense, that is all about having a sense of what's required of you, of what your role is. And there are ways that American life has changed beyond just in those two parts of life that leave us with fewer roles like that, where the sense is what people really want is total independence. And I think the equation that we make between freedom and independence is a pretty serious mistake. People don't really want independence. Independence isn't really possible anyway.
Right.
We're all dependent. And the question is, what kind of dependence? And is it, in fact, an interdependence where people rely on us and we rely on them? That's the way in which you give one another roles to play. And I think a certain kind of transformation in American life that says, go your own way, do your own thing. Obviously, at some level, that's attractive. We all want to have the freedom to explore who we are. But at some level, it does end up telling us that we don't have a role, that we don't belong, that
you're on your own.
Yeah, you're left alienated because people don't seem to have any expectations of you. And if no one needs you for anything, then you really don't know where you belong in the world.
So I said I did the statistics, now I'm going to say the story that I had. So this has to do with our oldest daughter, who just started medical school. And she was, as any first year medical student, she was anxious. She was feeling, concerned and anxious about, is she going to make it? There had an event during the first week of medical school that I thought was so interesting, and it was a pivotal event. It was called the white coat ceremony. So this is where, when you start medical school, you go through the white coat ceremony, which is you go on stage, and the doctors, who are the professors of the medical school, bestow upon these first-year medical students a short white coat, which is to distinguish from the long white coat that they're wearing, right? So it's like you still have some ways to grow, but it indoctrinates you in the right sense of indoctrination. It brings you into a set of ethics, a set of practices, a set of commitments, a set of relationships that is embodied in this moment of putting on your white coat. And then another beautiful part of the ceremony, they give you this stethoscope that has been bought by paid, and it's a great fundraising effort, I'm sure, but it was bought by some alum of Yale Medical School. In my case, my daughter got one from somebody who was a 1970 graduate of that medical school and wrote a personal note that said, this stethoscope, I encourage you to learn the old ways of, whatever you do with a stethoscope. and you can see my daughter has quickly surpassed me in all things medical. But I just thought, oh my gosh, that was so beautiful because it told her who she was going to be. It told her the virtues and the ethics and even the practices, like learn how to use the stethoscope. And I could almost sort of see it anchor her in this week of intense anxiety. Like, oh, this is my path. And it struck me like, we don't have white coat ceremonies nearly as much as we need to. Like when a teacher begins their career as a teacher, there's no equivalent to a white coat ceremony. When a lawyer, unless you're in England, there's no like bestowal of a robe. And so it strikes me that why we're really missing this. And have you say more about this sort of indoctrination, this formational, even at the very beginning of when somebody starts institutionalized, how we're missing this.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, and what it does is really give you a place, give you a sense of how you ought to think about where you belong. Now, I think it's worth saying, and the language of indoctrination points us in that direction, that institutions can become overbearing. There is a reason why we seek independence. There's a reason why we seek liberation. There are certainly times in the life of a free society like ours when our institutions are too strong and too overbearing. You can look at the culture of the United States in the wake of World War II, in the late 1950s, say, early 60s, and you find a culture that is screaming for liberation from very strong institutions, a society that had enormous confidence in its institutions. They had what we don't have, a lot of trust in professionals, in government, in big corporations, in big business. It's almost impossible for us to even put ourselves in that place. But it also felt itself to be forced into conformity in a way that drove a lot of what was happening in the culture of that time. And you find a process of cultural liberation, of economic liberalization that followed from that moment. We live after that process, and we live in a time when, rather than all the voices in our society telling us, be like everybody else, which is what those people felt like, all the voices in our society tell us, be yourself. And that's good up to a point. Everything is good up to a point. And we have passed that point in a way that I think has to do with a lot of the anxiety we feel now. It is not the anxiety of conformity, of I can't get away from these pressures. Those movies of the late 50s just make less sense to us. Holden Caulfield, you read them and you're like, just calm down, man. What are you doing? But we have a different kind of anxiety, which is a placelessness, a sense of an absence of belonging. It's worth seeing that you can go too far in either direction, but it's worth seeing that in this moment we have gone too far in this one. And so what we require is a kind of reacquaintance with the very concept of the institution.
I want to go back to what we talked about how institutions also help us deal with our anxiety because they help us deal with the future. So again, anxiety, as I understand it, it is the fear of future loss. If you think of any anxiety that you have right now, it is not about something happening right now in the moment. It's about something you're projecting as potentially happening and usually involving, not usually, always involving loss. All right, so anxiety is a fear of future loss. I think what's been really underappreciated is how institutions are anxiety managing devices for human beings, if you will. I think they're more than devices, but we'll get back to that. But they function to manage human anxiety. Why is this? Because think, if you are an individual on your own and you have to worry about everything that could happen in the future on your own, imagine that. Okay, are the bees going to die and you won't be left with your sweetener anymore? Is a terrorist plot brewing to blow up Washington, D.C.? Is an Ebola virus brewing right now, right at our doors? I mean, we could go on and on and on. The list of potential losses that you could experience in the future are endless, right? Why do we not go crazy? Why do we not go insane with anxiety? It's because we have institutions. We've sort of outsourced the worry. It's like, okay, Ebola, that's like CDC. They're supposed to have gotten that, right? A terrorist plot, that's the CIA or NSA or whoever, right? Like, there's somebody else that's supposed to deal with that. I don't know who deals with the bees. Who worries about the bees? Some institution out there is worrying about the bees. And so institutions are a way that human beings have developed a way to actually manage our anxieties by saying, this group of people are going to get together and they're going to hold the worries for the rest of you, right? we can't get rid of anxiety. We can only hold anxiety. That we can't actually navigate to a life where there's no possibility of loss in the future. We can only hold it, learn to hold it. And institutions are a anxiety holding being. They're right. They're a way in which we say you're the warrior for us all. So if institutions are breaking down, like as you scan the landscape, which kinds of institutions are especially fragile and are loosening, are losing their ability to hold worry for the rest of us?
Yeah, this is a really nice way to put this. One thing it brings to mind is there are some places in society where it does feel like it all falls on you. I spent 4 years working for President George W. Bush, and being president, if you wonder why everybody who runs for president seems like they're crazy, you'd have to be crazy to want to be president. The president really lives the way you describe. You read all the terrible things on the front page of the newspaper, and they're all your problem that day. That's no way to live. And let me tell you, it is really awful. And it really shows you the importance of, as you say, having a place to put these worries. Having a way in which there's a sense in which what civilization is a kind of network of institution that allows us to benefit from knowledge that we don't have to possess, that allows us to deal with problems that we don't have to fully understand, that allows us to contend with a world that is much more complicated than we could possibly contain. You wake up in the morning and you flip the switch and the light goes on. I don't know how. I tell myself if I really wanted to figure it out, I could, but I don't know. I'm not sure. Somebody knows how, and it does work. And that is a way to, as you say, contend with anxiety. If it all fell apart and I had to know how to fix it, that would be a source of tremendous anxiety. And I think for a lot of people, part of the anxiety of this moment is feeling like that's where they are. There's an enormous amount that falls on them, and it's too much to expect. I think there are some institutions that distinctly are failing in this way. And it has to do with the question of roles. Part of what forms the strength of an institution is that its role is defined. It doesn't do everything. It does some things. And that's why you're able to trust it to do those things well. And I think the institutions that are losing their integrity are those that are losing their sense of the limits of what they're supposed to be doing. There is a way now, especially around politics and the kind of culture war issues, where it seems like the sense of the distinct responsibilities of institutions is falling apart, and there's this kind of culture war venom that seeps into every institution, and suddenly the phone company has to have an opinion about abortion, and it's important for us to know what our doctor thinks about the election law. Yeah. And that becomes very, very difficult as a world to live in. Right. When everybody has to be responsible for everything, nobody's really capable of being responsible for anything. And I think a lot of the institutions that are failing most are those that find themselves in this situation, kind of at the intersection of the cultural, political, and a specific bit of work. So you see this in educational institutions where they have a role to play, but apparently they're also supposed to be advancing some political ideal. You see it in a lot of religious institutions where they have a role to play that is more than political, and yet they are drawn into a kind of political cultural place. And in educational institutions, it's mostly to the left these days, especially in higher ed. In religious institutions, you see it happening to the right. But it's the same kind of dragging of the institution in such a way where you suddenly have to ask yourself, are there sides here? And these people are not on my side? And so I can't go there anymore? I think that kind of sense, and of course some people have this sense about the police, some people have this sense about the companies that provide basic services in their lives. A lot of people have it about their children's schools. A lot of people have it about the kind of communal institutions that we all need in our lives. And so I think that breakdown of distinct roles and responsibilities and the reach of a certain kind of, it's not even politics, because it's actually happening in politics. It's happening to Congress, right? And so that can't be politics. Politics is what Congress does. I think there's a combination of politics and entertainment that doesn't really belong anywhere, and that is now seeping into everywhere and making it very difficult for anybody to really do the job they have in our society. And the institutions that are being degraded by it are political institutions, our educational institutions, and our religious institutions. But increasingly now, you also see it in corporate America. You see it across the range of American life.
I would just underline in the world that I know best, religious institutions, how much this has been just an utterly devastating trend for pastors, right? So, since COVID, they've had to be experts on public health, on vaccine reliability, and now as we head towards 2024, they're going to be called on to be somehow political commentators. These are people who went to seminary at best, right? Like they did not get a degree in political philosophy, and now they're called to actually answer to their congregants on every political issue possible. And not only answer, but they have to agree with them. Because if they don't, they're going to leave, right?
And part of the thing to see is that what's expected of them is fundamentally expressive. Yes. They have to show that they have the right opinion. And so their role becomes an expressive role. And oftentimes, the role you have in an institution is a kind of formative role, right? You're working within the institution to try to shape a realm of American life in a particular way, to shape people within it. Obviously, a church tries to shape people's souls. What's expected instead is that you stand on the institution and express the right opinion. And this is what I mean to say that it's even happening within politics. Our political institutions, Congress has a particular role to play. Its job is to facilitate negotiation across lines of difference to resolve public problems. Even in Congress, there's this pressure now to be purely expressive, to use the institution as a stage to stand on and express the right opinion. And oftentimes the right opinion is, I'm never going to talk to those people. And so people run for office saying, I'm never going to give an inch. And if you think for just a minute about what Congress is, they're running for office saying, I'm never going to do my job. And they keep that promise, right? The kind of deformation that you find is the same sort of deformation that's happening in our non-political institutions, because it isn't really politics that they're being shaped for. It's this kind of expressive culture war engagement that I think has to be kept out of all of our institutions for any of them to function.
All right, so we've been talking about how the degradation of our institutions, both their weakening, their failures, but also their mission creep, is causing anxiety in the broader society. Let's now turn the lens of anxiety back onto institutions. And I want to ask this question, is there such a thing as an anxious institution? Right? Our institutions themselves, can they become characterized by anxiety? And if so, what effects does that have?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I do think so. I think that there's a way that the process we're talking about from various angles can create such mistrust that institutions become incapable of the self-confidence that's required for them to do their work. A lot of what results from this process of deformation of institutions is mistrust. Institutions create trust. They rely on trust. They're built to both engender and ultimately channel trust. A free society requires an enormous amount of trust. We don't think about it very often, and we notice when we lose it, but there's still a lot of trust in American life. You have to believe that other people are doing what they're supposed to be doing all the time to an enormous degree that we really take for granted. And a lot of what makes a moment like this so difficult is that we're losing trust in one another in a way that means that adds enormously to our burdens all the time. And I would say there are a lot of ways to think about what trust is. Obviously, there's an entire massive academic literature about it. But for our purpose here, you might think of trust along two axes. Trust is a function of demonstrated restraint and demonstrated capacity or competence. You have to believe that the person in front of you is going to do their job and is capable of it. You also have to believe that they're not going to abuse their power, that they won't do less than their job, but also that they won't do more than their job. And a lot of the loss of trust that we're seeing now is a function of the second of those, of the loss of belief in the possibility of restraint. It's not that we don't think people can do their jobs, it's that we don't think they have any boundaries. And I think a lot of people in authority in our society think that when we don't trust them, it's because we think they're incompetent. And so they say, well, I actually know a lot about public health. That's what I do. I look at these degrees. And they're right, they really do. But the reason we have trouble trusting them is that we think they'll go beyond the boundaries of their proper authority. That's why people don't trust the police, not because they're not good at keeping order, but because people don't believe they'll stop. That's why we have trouble trusting a lot of elites in American life now. It's not that we think they're idiots, it's that we think they're irresponsible. And ultimately, that they won't keep from abusing their power. When an institution loses trust in that way, I think it does become internally anxious. It becomes difficult for it to know how to speak to the public it's supposed to speak to. It becomes difficult for it to know how it can do its job again. And, I would say my own career path has been here in Washington. And so a lot of where I've seen this happen is in public institutions that have a huge amount of trouble building and sustaining the trust of the public. Congress now, to go back to our most broken public institution, is a very anxious institution. It constantly has the sense that it's not up to this. And you talk to members about what they don't like about Congress, and they have a long list, but they always stop before talking about how to fix these things because they don't have the sense that they could do anything about it. So they'll say the budget process drives them crazy and they spend all the day raising money. And you say, well, you could just change that. If a majority of you agree about this, then you should just do it differently. It doesn't take any more than that. And that comes as news to an anxious institution. I think the idea that things could be different is not obvious when an institution loses its internal life, in a sense, feels like everybody's always watching everything that's going on internally, and loses its ability to engender trust. And I do think you see that across the range of American life now.
It seems like when an institution has lost its bearings in terms of its mission in the world, then it sort of devolves to a default mission of self-preservation and self-aggrandizement, right? So if it's not longer doing what it's supposed to do in the world, every institution exists to do something in the world, right? And that's the I believe God's purpose for every organization, whether you're a faith-based organization or secular. God, in my religious construct, has created or helped bring about this organization to do something in the world. If it has lost that mission, if it's no longer doing what God made that organization, made through human hands, made that organization to do, then it's going to default to self-preservation because it's like, well, what else can I do? I just got to protect myself. And this is actually, by the way, this is the origin of the name of my ministry, our ministry we have a lot of team members here, from Redeeming Babel. It comes from Genesis 11, the narrative of Babel. And I read that story to be basically the story of the fall that was told in the individual sense through Adam and Eve story in Genesis 1. That's the story of the fall told institutionally. Genesis 11 is basically saying sin has now taken on institutional forms. And what form does it take? Well, it says in that story, really interesting, it says, well, look, the fear is the people will leave Babel. They will be dispersed. They will scatter, which is God's actually intent for human beings. But the institution of Babel says, oh, we need to keep them with us. Because otherwise we may not thrive and survive. And so it creates this scheme, basically, which is basically built around brick building, which, as any good Jewish reader would know, that's a sure sign of an oppressive institution.
Always a bad sign.
Always a bad sign when the institution wants you to build bricks. It's
sheep good, bricks bad.
Exactly.
That's your summary of the Bible right there.
That's right, exactly. It's going back to the institution of Egypt and its oppression of the Hebrew and the foundational narrative. But in Genesis 11, you'll see that Babel is about brick making because it's a way to concentrate effort and energy around itself and make a name. That's what it says. Let us make a name for ourselves. It's no longer about its mission in the world. It's about self-preservation.
There's a line in that story where the people say, "We have bricks, so let us build a tower." That to me is an example of a loss of purpose, right? It's not we need a tower, but we have bricks, so let us build a tower. That's how a failing organization thinks, and I do think that it's a failure to think about purpose precisely.
Well, I want to end on this before we go into questions, which is, for myself, I draw so much from both the Hebrew Scriptures as well as the New Testament to make sense of institutions. I think we were talking about Leon Cass's commentary on Exodus and Genesis and Exodus.
If you let me talk long enough, I'll end up talking about Leon
Cass. That's right. He'll talk about Leon Cass and Aristotle. Those are his two go-to moves. And so for me, so much of my imagination about institutions has been informed by my theology, by my own spirituality. I'm curious for you as a devout practicing Jew, to what extent has your Jewish faith informed all of how you've been thinking about institutions?
You know, there's a way that what you lay out in your book struck me as quite Jewish. You have a subtitle that escapes me just now, but
Worry is the doorway to your best self.
yeah. So I mean, that's a very Jewish thing to say, right? You know, worry is like our superpower.
That's right.
That's what we do best and most. I think there's really something to that, and I would say that. My way of thinking about contemporary American challenges is very shaped by my Jewish formation in a couple of ways. First of all, it's infused with hope because I find it impossible to share in the catastrophism of this moment in American life. I am 2 generations removed from people who had to literally run away from Central Europe while their neighbors chased them with pitchforks and burned their homes. And so you want to tell me now that this is the lowest moment for religious liberty, and I'm just going to think, no, it is not. There's a long way down, and that means we've got a lot to work with and a lot to preserve, a lot to save, and a lot to build on. And the catastrophism of this moment that says we're at the edge of the abyss just doesn't ring true if you're formed by the kind of history that Jews have been formed by. It leaves you with enormous gratitude for America, where Jews are simply safer than we've ever been anywhere, ever. And it also leaves you with a sense that, I mean, I would say one advantage that American Jews have now is that we've always been a minority. And I find a lot of my friends in the Christian world are going through a process of coming to terms with being a minority. And that's
like
hard.
a political minority, you mean?
Yeah, political, cultural minority.
Yeah.
A sense that, from going from a sense that, well, this is ours, and, you know, we tolerate others, to going to a sense that this is a very, very diverse place, and we need to be tolerated here. Those are very different things. And there are ways, you know, there are real advantages to being a kind of moral minority in American society. There are also enormous disadvantages. And seeing both a little more clearly, I think, would be very helpful to a lot of my fellow kind of social, moral, religious conservatives now. And I think Jews just start out in a better place on that front. And because we have no illusions about being a majority. So I do think that shapes some of the hopefulness that I approach this moment with. I say hopeful, not optimistic. Don't be optimistic. That's silly. But I do think that it's very important to approach our situation with hope. Optimism is just like pessimism. Optimism says, you know, it's not up to me. Things are just going to happen. And maybe you think they're going to be great, and maybe you think they're going to be terrible, but you're wrong. They're not just going to happen. They're up to you. And hopefulness says things could go well if we are up to it, and if we deserve it, and if we do the work. And I think that is the right way to approach this moment.
That's a beautiful note to end our session, our part of it, but I'd love to actually take the next 15 minutes to take questions from the audience. This is why you come to a live podcast, is to throw your questions out. So can we get a mic over there? Thank you.
Great presentation. I would like to have both of you, if you can, address the institution of today's media, particularly the news media, because it strikes me that in our world of anxiety, the media has such an important role to dramatize everything, which creates more anxiety, because we look out and we see our world and it's hyped up. There's angst every day. And that, of course, makes us nervous, and they produce and promote the anxiety from other institutions. So in many respects, I think they're a culprit. And then part two, what to do about that.
I'll take a first pass, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So I think that the media institution is a perfect illustration of the two halves of the conversation we've been talking about, which is, on the one half, what's causing anxiety, and then also an anxious institution. You talk to anybody working in media today, they are working in an anxious institution because technology is broadly disruptive. There's no sense of stability. The sense of fear of future loss of your ratings, of your audience, of your platform it's intense. Like anybody working media is working in an anxious institution. So how do they cope with that internal anxiety? They actually try to use anxiety to build bricks for itself, to build an audience, to keep people for themselves, so that they don't disperse elsewhere to some other platform, to use the Genesis 11 language, right? So, and that's why news magazines are on a race to the bottom in terms of stoking anxiety, because they need to use anxiety to keep what little left of their audience tied to them. And so we're caught in this loop. An anxious institution is thus creating more anxiety in everyone else.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and there's an economic component here to the evolution of the media, particularly political journalism, that I think has to be kept in mind too, where it used to be that political journalism was supported essentially by classified ads and TV commercials, both of which needed broad appeal. You needed to be able to tell the department store in your city that everybody reads your paper. You needed to be able to tell GM that everybody watches the CBS Evening News. And that means you needed a product that everybody actually would read and watch. And you needed to have broad reach in order to be able to sustain yourself economically in journalism. In the age of the internet, advertising that is targeted is much more attractive than advertising that is just broadly sent out into the world. What advertisers want to hear is not that everybody watches, but that exactly the kind of people that you're looking to reach are watching this show. And that means you need to be able to tell advertisers exactly who your viewers are, which means you need to know exactly who they are, and that you need to build a specific audience. That means that rather than reach everybody with what is a broadly appealing kind of generic message, you're trying to reach a specific group of people. And the best way to reach a specific group of people and keep them engaged is by scaring the hell out of them all the time. That's just true. And so what you find in political journalism now is a system evolved to keep the audience coming back by making people angry and by making people afraid. It really is hard to survive otherwise in the contemporary economic realities of political journalism. And just as Curtis says, political journalism is barely surviving, so that those economic pressures are extremely difficult to deal with, and they have to find ways to keep the audience coming back, so that the cable news networks have to reach older viewers all the time, keep them engaged, keep them coming back tomorrow just as they came today. And they've found that what's required for doing that is the kind of political journalism that we have now. It's not good for politics, it's not good for our culture, but it is the way they survive now. So I think understanding that through the lens of a certain kind of anxiety is very important. It also, of course, is a particularly bad fit for the evolution of our culture more generally, the kind of fragmentation of our politics where there is much less of a mainstream. And I think these trends are connected. I mean, we've had a fragmentation because it is now possible to reach targeted audiences. It's how politicians think, too. They're not trying to get everybody out. They know exactly who's going to vote in the primary, and they want to reach those people. And, you know, when you hear a politician talking, you think, why the heck is she saying that? Well, she knows what those people want to hear. It's not you. It's somebody who's going to show up on primary day in their district. And that's what that kind of targeted politics looks like. I would say one more thing. I think that at some level, certainly in the political system, they're actually wrong to think that this is the way to win. Our political parties have been through a generation of losing now in this period. They've both been losing every election since the mid-1990s. Some of them have been losing slightly more than the others, and therefore you end up with a House majority of 3 members, as the Republicans have now. That's not a victory. Nobody's had a real majority since the middle of the 1990s. And that means that neither party has really won or really lost in a long time, which means neither of them has really learned very much about contemporary America in a long time. And I think finding a way out of this loop is part of what it will take to find a way out of this phase of our political life.
Good afternoon. One question I have for you is, you all had mentioned that when institutions go beyond their mission, when they try to do more, it breeds public distrust. But where's that balance between evolving with the culture, with the times, but not going too far to create that mistrust?
Well, obviously there's no simple answer to that question, but I think there's a difference between mission creep, really doing things beyond your institutional purpose, and an evolving understanding of how to achieve your institutional purpose. If you're running a school, you are going to do it differently today than you did 100 years ago. There's no way around that. The world has changed. It is important now to do things differently. And there are things we've learned, maybe there are things we've forgotten, but education looks different. That's different from an educational institution that takes it on itself to become a political platform. And I think that the distinction between the two can help institutional leaders tell the difference between a kind of evolution that can make them stronger and a kind that would make them weaker. You have to have a sense of purpose. And if it's not clear to you what problem you exist to solve, what question you exist to answer, what need you exist to meet, then you're on the path to a kind of deformation rather than evolution.
I'll answer that question as a management consultant, because this is a crucial question I have with all my clients. And the key diagnostic question I ask in deciding whether to take on this client is I ask them this question: what is your pain tolerance? Like, what is your ability to tolerate pain? The reason I ask that question is because usually organizations get into mission drift because they cannot tolerate pain. The necessary pain you need to do to actually go for a purpose and stick to it. Almost always when you see mission drift, mission creep, it's because people didn't want to make a hard decision. They didn't want to say no to something that would have actually exacted some cost. And that's usually what happens. So really it gets back down to, are organizations willing to make hard choices to actually stay true to their mission? And because, creep is always an avoidance of pain, almost always. Now, to give us all some compassion and some ability to extend grace to all of these organizations that we're saying are struggling competence, let me ask you how good you guys are all doing individually at finding and sticking close straight to your personal life mission, right? I think we would all say, myself included, it's hard. It's really hard. I'm not even sure I can name what my life's mission is, much less stick to it. So if it's hard for us as individuals, just think how hard it is for institutions, because that's what institutions are. They are human. An organization is a human being collectively. It's not a tool, it's not an instrument. They're beings. They're comprised of human beings. So the same struggles the same existential struggles you have as an individual with finding and sticking close to your mission in life, that's what organizations are, human organizations are struggling. And so that should give us all a little bit of grace, hopefully, and a little bit of understanding for when institutions struggle and fail. They're reflecting humanity. We're looking at a mirror.
Hi, I recently read The Quest for Community and Bowling Alone, and both of those, even though they're written 50 years apart, say that one of their answers is we need to build new institutions. And I know you like to end on a happy, hopeful note in your podcast. So I was wondering where the both of you look for what new institutions are being built today.
Well, it's a great question, first of all, and it's really great that you're reading The Quest for Community and Bowling Alone, both really important books in the realm of a kind of communitarian sociology, which I think is just what we need now. I read The Quest for Community with students every summer, and the striking thing about it is, well, I'd say the most amazing thing about that book is that it was written in 1953, which we now look to as the golden age of American civil society. If you take the world of communitarians and ask them, when would you want to go back to, they'd probably say roughly 1953. And yet, in that moment, you have Robert Nisbet, who was a scholar here at AI, by the way, saying that civil society is breaking down, that it's being displaced by both government and capitalism, that it's becoming impossible for institutions to serve their core civic purpose in ways that we would very much recognize now. It's actually a little hard to know what to make of that. In one sense, that means that this problem has always been with us, and that there's not a time we can really look back to and say, that's when we did it right, and we should find ways to go back to that time. I think that's good, because we're not going back to 1953. There are a lot of reasons not to want to, and in any case, it's not possible. The question for us always is how to go forward. And I think that book offers you a sense that what it means to go forward is, just as you say, to build institutions to meet needs that are native to our time. And so it isn't just a matter of sustaining institutions built for a different moment. We have to do that too. A lot of our institutions are timeless, or at least durable, and we have to work to sustain and keep them. But we also have to ask ourselves, where are there needs that ought to be met by institutions that are not being met by institutions? I think there's a lot of room now for institutional innovation in education. And there's an opportunity for that I think is really unmatched, that we have not seen before, where there's a willingness to try things out, both in primary and secondary education and in higher education. Both of those are places where you have to be very attentive to tradition, to what has worked, to what is always true, but where there's also some room to try new things and build new structures and see what can work, what can meet needs. I think there's also room for institution building in American civic life around needs like the integration of new immigrants. We all talk about immigration, but we actually don't talk very much about assimilation and integration. Our society is a little afraid to talk about it. But I think looking for ways to help immigrants learn English, there is not a national scale institutional arrangement for helping new Americans become full Americans. That's really shocking right now. It's hard to believe that we haven't built something to do that, but we have not. And I think there's a lot of room to do that now. And beyond that, I think there is room for institution building in and around our politics, especially in the places that our parties have traditionally occupied, that they now that the parties are essentially brands rather than institutions with local reach, there's room to do some building on that front too.
I'm going to take a page out of Yuval's, I think it's one of his last chapters, which is think local. That where our institutional innovation is going to happen, I think, is at the local level. I'm like at the neighborhood level. Because it is not good for humans to be alone. This is the first of God's diagnosis of the human condition. So, and when he means not to be alone, it's not like so we get connected to some online community. It's face-to-face embodied community, and which, by the way, is all the scholarship shows is a tremendous anxiety-lowering move to actually get in face-to-face embodied relations with other human beings. It's one of the best things you can do to lower your anxiety. One of the worst things you can do to raise your anxiety is to be isolated and be in only disembodied connections on screens. So I would say where I would be looking for signs of hope is at the local community. Is there some community that's coming up with a new way to educate the local immigrants in their county or their city, or to figure out how to construct a new park that you need, that clearly all the kids don't have a place. These local problems are so much more manageable than these broad national intractable problems. Like those problems are landing on the president's desk precisely because they're unsolvable by anybody else. So as citizens, we should be looking for the problems that are closest to us, that are actually manageable and solvable, and that we can solve with other human beings that we live with, next to, close to. And out of that, I think there's gonna be a bottoms-up emergence of ideas that actually may scale up. But we don't even need to worry about whether they'll scale up. Let's just create hope in our own lives, in our own communities, and let's start there. And I want to emphasize that about the importance of doing that as I close here, because for anybody who does listen regularly to the Good Faith podcast, I close with this invitation that next week we will once again gather around the campfire. I choose that metaphor very carefully because that's what this podcast is. It's a campfire. A campfire is not a permanent structure. It's not a permanent establishment. It's a way station. So for all people who really are our target audience, who feel isolated, wandering, homeless, by all means find campfires where you can find some common identity, common cause, but don't stay there. A campfire is meant as a way station onto a hearth. A hearth is what we need. Hearths are where we gather around in durable structures in relationships of trust and solidarity and common cause. We need those. And this podcast exists as a camp. It's not an institution. You're not going to find your belonging and your role and your mission as a listener to a podcast. Okay? It's a campfire to guide you on the way to your hearths. So with that, thank you so much for joining us here. And to all you listeners out there, once again, do join us, though, when we gather once again around the campfire.